Welcome to Microsoft Virtual Academy. Today we're talking about developing for Windows 10, and in this particular module we're going to be talking about application patterns. I'm Darren May, President and co-founder of Crank 211. We're a digital agency that produces next level experiences. And to my left is Jeff.
I'm Jeff Morgan. I'm a developer at Crank 211, specializing in Windows development.
Great. Just set some expectations around this session. We're going to be talking about universal Windows apps, so obviously we're expecting the audience to be interested in this. Suggested prerequisites, we are expecting basic C# knowledge. There's plenty of resources on Microsoft Virtual Academy for that, as well as a basic understanding of XAML. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about? Oh, I forget. Other recommended resources. Go to dev.windows.com where you'll find all the tools, design guidelines, and so on and so forth about building Windows universal apps.
Indeed.
So, app patterns.
App patterns. We're going to talk about the look and feel of your app, how to give it your own unique personality, and the kinds of ways you can do that across different platforms. We're going to talk about those particular patterns in depth, and then we're going to talk about frames and pages, ways you can navigate between different pages to display different content. And then we are also going to talk about handling back navigation, because there's some interesting scenarios you need to deal with different paradigms. So.
Okay, and then we're going to introduce a community project called Template 10 and run through a quick sample of how you can leverage Template 10 for navigation. Okay, so let's start talking about look and feel. So there's been a bit of a paradigm shift, I would say, in Windows 10 compared to Windows 8 and Windows 8.1, in that I think there's a lot more flexibility available in Windows 10, and you're kind of expected to really embrace that.
Yeah, when you started a new Windows 8 project, you usually got a collection of templates you could pick from. There was Grid, there was Hub, there was Split View, but a lot of people basically just picked Grid and then you went for it. And if you notice, when you create a Windows 10 app now, that doesn't exist. You have one template, the blank app template, and it's very blank. There's nothing in it besides a blank page in it. You need to go and put your own kind of personality into the page after that. So yeah, certainly a shift.
And I think that was clearly a reaction to the fact that, as you mentioned, the templates appeared to be very prescriptive in Windows 8.1. So you chose your foundational pattern, as you mentioned, the grid, the hub, the split app, or whatever, and then you stuck with it. And it seems like there was very little imagination employed within those particular scopes. So every app ended up looking pretty much the same. Tilepalooza, really.
Yes, we had a whole lot of different tile apps that didn't have a whole lot of differences between them.
So let's see what's available for us to help us actually be more expressive in our apps. So the first one that we're looking at here is the active canvas. So Jeff, what would you use the active canvas for?
Active Canvas would be used for if you have a document viewer, you are drawing in an app, something where you have a single pane of content that you are going to edit only that content. And then you're probably going to have very minimal navigation other than that. You're going to have maybe a file open kind of thing, but you're not going to have a bunch of navigation flipping back and forth between pages. You're going to have a single pane of content.
Okay, so we're talking really something like a paint program where we might have almost a film strip of different images, but we're going to touch one of those. So all the additional secondary information is almost overlaid on that canvas display rather than navigating to separate windows.
Exactly.
Okay, great. At the bottom of here, we actually have a link on this slide that takes you to the resources that are available on MSDN, so that you can see in greater detail some of the guidance that's available here. So guidance for the active canvas. So here we have the image. It introduces the content and how we should be approaching this. It gives us some great examples of some of the canvas style applications, showing again some sort of photo editing. Here is a much more interesting kind of data visualization that's being created. So good examples of these things and some guidelines. And as you can see here, this whole site has a lot of guidance around content and controls.
Yeah, it's a very good resource if you are looking at designing your app in the initial stages.
Absolutely. So let's look at the next pattern. So here we have master detail.
So master detail is going to be useful if you have a list of content, a lot like a mail app or something like that, where you have content that you need to get a full screen view of when you click it in the list.
Okay, so master detail, good for displaying hierarchical information so you can drill through and so on.
Indeed.
Gives you a good overview of the master records that are available to you so you can navigate through by quickly clicking between them and displaying different content in the details pane.
Exactly.
Okay, great. And again, we have the link on the slide to the design patterns. We shan't visit there again. Okay, the next major pattern is tabs and pivots. What can you tell me about that, Jeff?
Tabs and pivots are when you have disparate categories of content in your application where you are going to go from one to another. You need quick navigation between them, but they're very large categories that aren't changing very much.
Okay, so an example would be a news application or something like that.
Exactly.
So a lot of categories can be displayed, and there's the options to have scrolling across those categories. But again, it really gives you very quick navigation between those content.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Navigation pane.
So navigation pane is pretty common now in most of the universal apps. It's the slide-in menu that you see from the left where you can store things off-screen when you don't need them, but you can bring them in when you do need them.
So it's often referred to as kind of the hamburger navigation.
Hamburger menu.
Okay. And so, I mean, it seems to me, though, that there's a temptation here for it to use it as a dumping ground for anything you can't fit on your regular UI.
Sure, everybody's got the drawer in the kitchen, you know, where you put everything in the world in there, and then you just push it and hide it away. The split pane view is very easy to become that, your miscellaneous drawer. So it takes a lot of discipline to make sure that you do not go ahead and just use everything in there.
Okay. So what about these situations where you've dreamt up this amazing application and it doesn't quite fit any of these stereotypical patterns, if you like?
Very few apps do. Most apps have, you know, you've got accounts, then you've got your categories, you've got whatever content. There's a lot of different paradigms that you could fall into. Usually you have to mix and match them. And so you'll split your content up a little bit.
Okay, so we can leverage multiple patterns, and one of the great examples of multiple patterns is the MSN News app. So if we open this up, here we have the News app, and so here we have categories.
You have categories across the top, tabs and pivots.
Tabs and pivots, so we can navigate through these, but we have the hamburger menu, so we can pop this open, and we can move between large general areas.
Of course.
Jumping backwards and forwards between content, and then this is also a place where commonly the settings are placed in an application. And again, here we have a pivot that allows us to move between these areas of content as well. So I think this is a great pattern for a composite application that really brings a lot of these design activities together.
Yeah, definitely. You shouldn't feel bad about using different paradigms in your app all at the same time. As long as you are consistent in your methodologies and you kind of make it clear and concise to the user about how to navigate through your app, you can certainly mix the paradigms.
Okay, awesome. So, all of this being said, what we've certainly found in our sort of personal development activities is one of the key patterns that is used most often building applications is the navigation. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time doing a bit of a deeper dive into the navigation application, the patterns, how you implement it. First and foremost, looking how to do it as part of the existing application blank template, and from there kind of drilling down a little bit further. So how do we navigate? What is the core elements that we need to leverage? Well, we have a number of controls that are present inside the framework that allow us to perform navigation. We have the frame control, which is really the parent for our navigation, and it works very much like a browser window so that we can actually show multiple pages of content. And in actual fact, that's what they're referred to in our navigation pattern is the page control. Page control is shown within frame. The frame does a lot of the work for us in terms of determining, okay, can I navigate forward? Can I navigate backwards? It maintains a history of navigation, again, very much like a browser history. It also remembers if we're passing parameters to and from elements inside there. Anything to add on that?
No, I think you summed it up quite nicely.
Okay, great. So let's talk about navigating between pages. Why don't you take this one?
Navigation between pages, it's pretty simple. There is commands on the frame object that will allow you to navigate, and you will simply pass the type of the page that you want to navigate to. So for example, here we have a employee list page where possibly you would see a list of all the employees in a company, and all you do is pass the type of the page. And you're going to do that using the type of command and the navigate on the frame.
Okay. And so what we're doing really here is we're delegating to the frame the responsibility of managing the life cycle of the page. We're saying, hey, if create an instance of this page and display it in my content area. There's also some caching activities that we can set up as part of this. We can actually have the frame maintain a cache of these pages, and it can actually turn around and say, oh, I already have a version of the employee details page. I'm going to pull it out of my cache rather than creating a new instance. So
which is useful if your pages take a long time to create, if you've got a lot of background services that run, if you've got a lot of tasks that need to be done. Anytime you create a new page, if you can cache it, all the better.
The flip side of that is if your page is very large and heavyweight and you're running on a more resource-constrained device, such as a phone or whatever, having this sitting in the memory could actually be bad for overall system performance. So again, there's an option
a little bit of
for not necessarily wanting to cache it, which is great. Okay.
Conversely, we can also pass parameters fairly easily as well.
Right.
So at the end of navigate, you can simply pass a parameter. It can be any object, and it will come back through on the page as just an object.
So any object. So if I've just pulled down War and Peace from the database, I can pass War and Peace as my object.
I wouldn't recommend it, but you could if it is serializable.
Okay. What if it's something that maybe I've created a very complex type? I might be able to serialize it, but would this be useful for, say, if we had to save our navigation history at some point?
Probably not. At that point, you probably want to look at other ways of passing it to
So perhaps pass an ID to War and Peace.
Pass an ID, some kind of link or reference to it that you can get it. That way you're not passing it all through the navigation stack.
Okay, that's excellent. Great. Why don't you show some code on how to do this?
Sounds good. So I will go ahead and move to Visual Studio here. I have created a blank app here. All I did was File, New Project, and created a blank Windows Universal app. And we are going to start by looking at our main page here.
Actually, let's have a look at the app.xaml code behind so we can see how our frame gets set up.
Indeed, let's do that. I think that would be a much better way to start here. So we looked at this a little bit in previous modules, but the onLaunched is where everything starts, and that is also where our frame gets created, right? The root frame.
Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. So here we have frame root frame equals Windows current content as frame. So what we're doing is saying, okay, let's have a look at the Windows current content. If there happens to be content, is it a frame? The next thing we're doing is we're checking to see if it's null. There's a key thing here that is very important to understand about building these Windows Store apps, these Windows UWP apps. Your onLaunched event can be called many times during the life cycle of your application. If it's starting from scratch, it hasn't been run, then your content is going to be null because you haven't put anything in there. If, however, your app is already running, then you will have content in your current window. This helps us know whether we need to initialize the navigation or whether we can actually leverage the existing navigation.
So you're saying even though my app is already running, this method can get called again?
Correct. And there are multiple examples of that. We'll deal more detailed in a suspension and resume scenarios later on, but fundamentally, you can click on a primary tile, a secondary tile, you can do voice activation, many different scenarios, launch your app, or in many cases, relaunch an app that's already running.
Gotcha. So then if my app has never been launched, root frame will be null, and I will create a new frame. If I create a new frame, I'm going to hook up a couple of event handlers here, right? I've got, in case my navigation fails, maybe I want to do something, I want to handle that nicely. And then I'm going to set the content of the window, the current shell window that I'm in, to be the root frame itself.
Okay. So that would then, if we scroll back up just to look at our check, that check there for where we're assigning root frame, that would now, if we re-entered, would pull out the frame we just assigned.
Right. And if we didn't do that, every time you came into your app, you would blow away whatever you were looking at, and you would restart your app every time, which is not a very good user experience.
Something would be unfortunate. We'll also see there's a to-do sitting there where we're checking to see the previous execution state. When we're talking about knowing whether the app has been relaunched or has been launched from scratch, the execution state helps us on that. And we'll go into more detail on that in another module.
Definitely. So the next step, now we've got our frame, our browser window as it be inside of our app,
Yep.
we need to put something in there.
Okay.
If nothing is in there already, we're going to go ahead and go to a base page, right?
Okay.
Whatever our initial page.
So if we revisit our start from scratch scenario, we've created a root frame. It will have no content in there.
Right.
We could also be relaunching our application. So we had a root frame already, but maybe we never displayed any content in there. And so in this scenario, this is where we catch that. So we've got a root frame, great. What's content do we have in there? Oh, we don't have any. So our default action is going to be to navigate to our main page in this situation.
Yep.
Great.
After that, we activate the window, and we should navigate to the main page. We should show the main page inside of our navigation frame.
And so when we activate a window, what we're actually doing is telling the operating system, display this, bring it through into the foreground so that the user can interact with it.
Right.
Great.
So if we pull up our main page, we can see it inherits from the page class. And right now it's just a blank grid. We're going to go ahead and make this a little bit easier to make sure that we know what page we're on. I'm going to give this a wonderful light green color.
I should mention to everybody that Jeff is in fact colorblind.
Well, you know, it looks fantastic to me, I think. Okay, and we're also going to add a title here. So I'm going to add a text block with the text property of main page, just so we can keep track of where we are.
Want to put that at the top?
I do want to put that at the top. Actually, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see. At the very top of my screen, you can see I have just main page.
Perfect.
Next, I'm going to go ahead and add a second page that we're going to try and navigate to. So we're going to go add new item. And you'll see here there are two options here, XAML view and blank page, both of which look very similar.
And it's very unfortunate that it seems that XAML view is the default.
It has the default, and they even have the same icon. Unfortunately, these are very different. A XAML view is going to be just a .xaml page.
So no code behind.
No code behind there.
Okay.
And that will not help you if you were trying to make a page that you are going to navigate to.
When would you use a XAML view?
Use a XAML view if you are trying to make a style, custom controls, other things that don't require code behind.
Or also, how about if you're actually building multiple views for different devices? So you could use a XAML view, have multiple XAML views that share the same code behind.
Indeed, that is another way. That is another new feature of Windows 10. For now, we're going to use the blank page, and we're going to call this the aptly named secondary page.
Wonderful.
It is.
Gee, I wonder what it does.
We're going to do the same thing here, except I'm going to make the background here light blue instead, and we are going to copy that same text block and change the name here. Actually, that is fairly hard to see, so we're going to switch back to that.
Okay, so this is going to be the secondary page title so that we can not only tell by color but also by content.
Indeed.
Okay, great.
So now we need to actually navigate between these. Probably use a button to indicate that we are ready to navigate to the second page.
So this is if you're building your own kind of navigation framework or whatever, but you want to leverage frame and so on.
Indeed.
And you can take this approach. Okay, great.
I'm going to add a button. The aptly named title.
Okay. Going to position it in the center of the
Yep, we're going to go ahead and put it right in the middle. Can't miss it.
Yeah, you might find it easier if you hit enter as you put those things in, rather than scrolling all the way to the right there.
Indeed.
Okay, so we got that. Now we need a click event on the button.
We do. So I'm going to add a click event. And if I just tab through this, it will create a click event for me, but it's not a very nice name. It's not very descriptive here. So I'm going to do the navigate button click event. And then I'm going to go to my code. Alternatively, you can come to your main page XAML. You can hit the down drop, and you can come to main page XAML CS to navigate here as well. You can see the button click handler was moved here, but we will change this to, what did I name it? Navigate?
Navigate.
Navigate. Just make sure I get the event right here. Great, so when I click this button, I want to navigate the particular frame.
Perfect.
The page that I am in actually has reference to the frame that I am contained in.
Because the frame creates the page, so it must inject itself into the page as it does so.
Exactly.
Okay, great. How'd you get to that?
Simply enough, the word frame will get me to the frame of the page that I am in.
Perfect.
And you can see here, if we just take a quick glance through, you have a lot of navigation events, go back, go forward. We're going to go through some of these, but the one we want right now is navigate.
Okay, great.
And as we said, you need to pass the type of the page that you want to go to. So we're going to do the type of secondary page.
Okay, perfect.
Great. So now,
So, shall we have a look and see how that runs?
see how that runs.
Great, and you're running this on the local machine?
I'm running this locally here.
Okay.
We'll wait for Visual Studio to do its thing.
Okay, so here we go. Here's the
We have our main page. Nice
main page,
green.
nice and green. Go to secondary page. Okay, now
Look
we've
at
got
that.
secondary page. Great, awesome. Jeff, how do we get back?
You don't want to go back. I thought one page would be good enough.
Okay, so as you mentioned beforehand, there are some options that are presented in terms of how to deal with this. Maybe we should take a little look at some slides and
Yeah, let's go back
review
to the
some of them.
slides and look at a couple of our different options for back navigation.
Okay, so handling back navigation. Let's talk about that. So handling. So we've got all these different devices, and we've got some devices that are built from the ground up to support the concept of back. You know, Windows Phone introduced this, and it's been continued forward into the later versions of Windows Phone and what's coming in Windows 10 for mobile. Is we actually have an on-screen back button that's available all of the time.
Right.
So the applications we build don't need to have their own version of a back button.
Right. It's built into the OS. It's always available. You don't have to implement it yourself.
Okay. You may remember from the Windows 8 and 8.1 applications, we actually had to put our own back button in every single app. And so that's where a lot of the design guidelines came from, was ensuring that each app had the back button in the same place, so it was a very consistent experience. As we move over into Windows 10, we've got a lot of options now, because this idea of your app that fills the entire screen all of the time has been moved offside to support Windows. So if we look down the bottom right of this particular slide, we see an app here that shows we have a back button within the app itself. Now this happens to be in the title bar, but we could also actually have it within the surface of the app inside the content area as well. But on desktop, our apps don't always run inside Windows.
Right. You can be windowed and therefore don't have a back button.
Yep, or you can be maximized, and you could switch your desktop or your tablet over into tablet mode, and so then we have another option that appears, which is a global back button that appears, if we look at the slide. We have a global back button that appears down on the start menu, and that is scoped to the current application in the foreground.
Right, so that can be a little confusing, right? Sometimes I have a back button and sometimes I don't. So what would I want to do to ensure that I have a consistent experience for the user?
So I think there's a couple of different ways we want to do it. Is we want to detect what mode we're in, so that we can respond to our states. So that's a key activity. We perhaps need to understand what platform we're running on as well, so that we can turn around and say, okay, we're never going to show a back button on Windows Mobile, because that's always going to be present regardless of what mode we're in, unless perhaps we're in continuum mode.
Right.
In which case we then may need to detect that we're in that mode and to change our UI. So it gets fairly complex tracking these things. Fortunately, there are some APIs that are built in that helps us out with some of this.
Great. Well, maybe we should take a look at some of those.
Why not?
I think that would be great. Okay.
So we've got the application title bar here, and so we have the can show back button in title bar. So this is a system-wide, or an application-wide setting, I should say, that leverages the System Navigation Manager to actually project this. And so we can control that visibility and also determine whether we show it based upon whether we can go back.
Right.
And whether perhaps the application has subscribed to using this approach. Equally, we can also extend all of our content into the title bar, which then means we have to actually take control of rendering back buttons in the title bar. We can't necessarily use that global back button.
Does that mean I lose all of the control? Because you could do this in WPF where you could take control of the whole window, but then you would lose the grip resizing and the dragging around of the screen. Do you have to deal with that?
Fortunately, most of that is now included within the frame, the window that's being presented. You have the option to leverage the system maximize, minimize, and close buttons, so you can have those displayed on top, or you can actually implement your own if you should so wish. So there's a lot of flexibility there.
Gotcha. So I can build the title bar if I want. I can build it however I want and control everything, or I can delegate whatever parts I want back to the OS to deal with.
Absolutely.
Great.
Very powerful. Why don't you go ahead and show how to leverage the back buttons, perhaps some work with the title bars.
Sounds good. So here in Visual Studio, we'll come back here, and we'll jump back into our app.xaml.cs file. At the end of this, we want to enable, first off, the back button in the title bar. Let's start with that.
Okay.
So I'm going to put in a event handler here, and I'm going to bring in some code that I've written previously, where if I navigate the root frame at all, I want to see whether or not I want to show that back button in the title bar. So I'm going to hook up this event handler, and if we look at what it does, anytime the root frame navigates, we actually want the navigated method, sorry. Anytime the root frame navigates to a new page, we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab the root frame, and then we're going to do the System Navigation Manager, get for current view, and we're going to look at the app button visibility. Do you want to explain a little bit what get for current view does?
Yeah, so in effect, it's understanding what window we're currently in and the environment we're actually running, so it'll pull in. We can have multiple windows now in our applications because
that's a new feature.
In a Windows environment. Yes, Windows in Windows, who'd have thought? So sometimes you may have a different window in focus. You know, activated is the current one you're interacting, so this will make sure that we bring back the System Navigator instance that's bound to our current active view.
Right, because we have a second window, we may or may not want to use the back button in that one. Maybe we've got just a picture full screen view that we don't need to back navigate.
Great.
So here we're going to look at whether or not the root frame can go back, if there is a navigation stack to move back with. And if there is, we're going to show the button. If there isn't, we're going to hide it.
Okay.
Simple
now,
enough.
one key thing to notice here is everybody may be familiar with using visibility.collapsed and visibility.visible. Please note that the enumeration here is different. And a lot of this is to do with how WinRT sits on top of the operating system and how it sits on top of COM objects. So the reality is there's a different low-level set of flags that determine the visibility of the global back button. And so that's why this is different from visibility.visible.
Gotcha. But with the power of IntelliSense, this is pretty easy. It pops right up for you. You don't have to worry about remembering that this one's a little bit different.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, and we'll take a look at our new title bar. So you can see here initially, nothing's different because I currently don't have any back navigation. There's nothing that I came from to use backs. But if I hit go to secondary page, I now have a built-in back button in my title bar.
Okay, that's great. And you click on it? Oh.
I click on it, and it doesn't work.
It's because you haven't hooked up anything to respond to it.
I haven't hooked up. So you've got to also subscribe to the event coming from the OS saying, somebody has clicked to go back, you need to do something with this now.
Okay, seems like a useful thing to show.
It does seem like a useful thing to show. So we're going to bring in another method here. If I can get my keyboard working right here. The app back requested. And this is a OS level event here for your app. Much like the same, we're getting for the current view, and if the back button is clicked, what do we want to do with it?
Okay, so we're basically just subscribing to that event so that we can now interact with that.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
And if we look inside of the back requested, First, we're going to check whether or not it's handled, whether or not somebody else has already dealt with this event before it ever got to us.
Okay.
If so, we don't want to do anything.
This is event bubbling.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're familiar with event bubbling, where they go from one handler to the next, waiting for somebody to trigger this e.handled flag to true.
Okay.
It's the same thing going on here.
Great.
We're going to go ahead and grab the frame from our window, and then we're going to see if the frame can go back. If it has the back navigation history. If it does, we're going to go ahead and just tell it go back.
Okay.
Nice simple method to go ahead and go back to your previous. The navigation frame has a record of everything that you came from. Go ahead.
And because we're a good citizen, we're saying, hey, we handled this event, nobody else needs to.
Exactly. Nobody else needs to. Don't bubble anymore.
Okay.
So now if we run and go to our second page and come back, we navigate correctly.
Oh, that's perfect.
Easy enough. Let's take a look at this on a Windows phone.
Okay.
And see how this works.
Sounds good.
So I'm going to change my debug target from local machine to my emulator.
Unfortunately, the emulator is already running.
You should always keep it running.
Yes. Okay, so it's going through to deploy. Okay, here's our app in glorious Technicolor.
Glorious. But I don't have the back button at the top anymore because I don't have a title bar.
Where's it gone? Oh, there it is.
I have the built-in button.
Perfect.
And I can navigate.
And so what we can see here is the same APIs are available, and this is very key to understand about UWP. The APIs, the core APIs, are available across all of the platforms.
Right.
Just the behavior is appropriate for the target platform.
Definitely.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Why don't you show us implementing a back button and passing parameters?
Sounds good, yeah, because you might not always want a back button built in by the OS. Maybe you want to do something special.
Yeah.
All right, so back here in Visual Studio, we'll go ahead and stop this from running. And we will take a look at our secondary page here. Underneath this text block, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a button.
Is that typically where you'd place it?
Typically, you would put it in the upper left-hand corner. That's kind of the default. But you can, of course, up to your style and how you'd like to make it.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and use a static resource in here that is built into UWP, the navigation back button style. This is a collection of default styles. If you just want to put a back button up, just a back arrow, you don't need a bunch of styling, you can use these built-in templates to give you an arrow.
Okay, perfect.
And so if we take a look at that, we can see that it just gives us a nice little back arrow here.
Okay, nice.
And I'm going to put this just right there, and I'm going to put a click event on here. And if we go to this click event here, we're going to do the same thing we did if we were coming from the OS level back button. We're going to do frame.goback on the button click.
Okay, and so what we're doing here is we're just assuming that we can go back?
Just assuming we can. In reality, if you were writing this production level, as you should be, you should check to see if you can go back. And if you can't, you should hide the button
and a great
or
example
disable.
for that would be if we had done deep linking using, say, a secondary tile and navigated directly to that second screen as part of that deep link scenario, we wouldn't have a back history at this point.
Exactly. You come right back here, which it brings an important point. You need to have navigation away from your secondary pages besides the back button if you do support deep linking and other things that go straight to a particular page.
Great.
So here we now have a back button.
Okay.
That lets us go back and forth.
Perfect.
I like to go ahead and deploy this to IoT because there's a particular case that this affects if you deploy this to a device. So actually I'm going to change to ARM because IoT is ARM. And we're going to deploy to the Raspberry Pi here.
Okay, so that's your remote machine. Away we go. So
we
actually have the Raspberry Pi is sitting on the floor right next to us here, which is one we prepared earlier. And we have a little hardwired mouse that connects in there so that we can interact with that Pi device once it's up and running. So unfortunately, it takes a little while for us to connect to it, and then we start to deploy. So now will probably be a good time to switch over and show the Pi. So here we are. This is the app running. We have a mouse pointer, as you can see, using this manual mouse. Now we're deploying the application. So here we are. We have the same application with our ability to go to a secondary page. I'm going to click on the secondary page.
But if you notice, there's no title bar and there's no built-in back button on an IoT device. So if you don't supply a back button on an IoT device or some platforms, you may not have any navigation. So it's an important thing to keep.
But fortunately, here's one you just created.
Indeed.
I click on this
and go back.
Navigate back.
Great.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so coming back to Visual Studio here, it would be helpful to pass parameters sometimes. Sometimes you want to get a details view. You want to pass some information to your secondary page.
Okay.
So I'm going to come back to my main page, CS, and this is the line where we were doing the actual navigation. If I look at the parameter here, I can go ahead and I can pass my parameter. This could be a whole host of objects. For now, we're just going to use a simple string.
Took you a long time to come up with that one, though.
It did. It did indeed.
Excellent.
In the secondary page here, we're going to come into override a method that exists here called onNavigated_to. This method will be called on the page when you navigate from another page, and it gives you access to that parameter that you displayed as well.
Great. Seems like that there probably is more than just this one navigation style event on a page.
Indeed. So as you would expect, if we take a look to, there's onNavigated from, onNavigating. Maybe you want to go into a little bit of what the differences are between them?
So onNavigating is raised when a request has been made to leave this page and allows you to do some form of action. Maybe you want to save a record before you leave. Maybe you want to do a validation. So maybe you could actually cancel the navigation activity if this page isn't currently in a state in which you want to navigate from. Navigated occurs after the page has been navigated from, so that then allows you to release any event handlers you may have subscribed to.
Do a little cleanup.
Do any cleanup and so on and so forth to perhaps reduce the memory footprint of the page.
Great. Here, just to show our parameter, I'm going to come into the secondary page and give the text block for the title a name so that I can change its value. And I'm just going to set the title text.text property equal to the parameter. I know it's a string, so I'm going to go ahead and cast it to a string, but obviously
defensive coding,
this is not. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this locally.
First and foremost, because we don't have a keyboard on our...
Because we don't have a keyboard on the Raspberry Pi, that would be difficult.
Yeah.
And you can see the title has now changed to my parameter. So we've been able to pass a parameter from page to page, giving at least a little bit more information about where we came from.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great.
So that was a great demo that showed how we could implement navigation, leverage the back button, and so on and so forth. One of the things that we talked about was leveraging something like Template 10, which was a framework that was going to help us not have to continually build this boilerplate code.
Right, it's a lot of code.
It is a lot of code. You're having to do a lot of stuff manually and so on. So what is Template 10? Well, it's an open source framework that, as I mentioned, provides a whole bunch of boilerplate code, not only around navigation, but application lifecycle management, interaction with various system level capabilities, and so on and so forth. But right now we're going to focus on navigation. So it certainly implements an abstraction around navigation that helps with simplifying the approach that we need to take. It makes it easier to integrate with the system back, or to indeed use your own back capability if you should so wish. It's available on NuGet, so if you look at that particular link, you can see the NuGet website that allows you to install that. We also have created a Visual Studio extension that makes the templates available for creating Template 10 based projects. There's a minimal template that is, in effect, a starter application that implements some basic navigation paradigms, which I think is what you're going to be using in a demo shortly.
Yes.
There's also a blank template that leverages Template 10 as the startup environment for your application, but doesn't give you anything else. You can then implement most of that yourself. So why don't you go ahead and show using navigation in Template 10.
All right, so I'm back here in Visual Studio. We'll go ahead and look at Tools, Extensions, and Updates, and I'll show you where you can get Template 10. If you come here to Online, and then we'll type in Template 10.
So this is Template 10, the Visual Studio extensions that installs the templates.
Right, so this will get you the basic and minimal templates, but if you want to just add the services for template 10, you can go ahead and do that through NuGet actually.
Okay.
So I've already installed this, and I have just the basic app running here. So let's go ahead and run this and take a look at what we get for free with the template. So you can see right off the bat, I have a little bit of navigation. I've got a slide-in split view menu on the left, and if I come in here to settings, you can see there's a couple of options I can trigger. There's an option for use shell drawn back button, or if I trigger that on, I gain a back button up here, but I've actually lost the built-in navigation button in settings, and I can toggle that option on and off there.
Great. So we've got two choices really. We can choose to be using the shell provided one, or we can handle it ourselves. That's great.
Exactly. So I will go back here to main page. You can see here that I can pass a parameter here. I'm going to use the aptly named my parameter as usual. If I hit submit, you can see we get navigation just like we did before.
Great.
I can pass a parameter and I can navigate back.
Okay, perfect.
So let's take a little bit of a look at how this works in template 10.
Okay, so it's important to bear in mind template 10 does an awful lot for us. What we're going to focus on right now is just what we implement as part of navigation.
Exactly.
Great.
So if we take a look first at app.xaml, we can see it's very short compared to our previous app.xaml, and there isn't anything in here for frame at all.
Okay.
So all of that is handled by the bootstrapper, which takes care of creating a root frame for us, and so we don't have to deal with any of that internal plumbing.
Perfect. We also have a property that's exposed up there. If you scroll up into the initializer there at the top.
Sure.
So just scroll down a little bit. We've got the show shell back button. So that, by setting that to true, that uses the shell back button, or setting it to false would hide the shell back button.
Exactly. Right now it's just using a built-in tracker for what that toggle is set to.
Great.
If we scroll down here to the bottom, you can see that there's just a single method on start that specifies what our initial page is going to be in this case. In this case, it's main page.
And so we're also using navigation service here rather than frame. So,
right, it's not a frame here.
So template 10 provides an abstraction. The navigation service will always be referencing the appropriate frame for a given view, and this allows us to navigate. But it looks pretty much identical to if
it looks very
frame.navigate.
Very similar. Let's go and look at the main page's code here. And if we come down here for the button to go to the details page, we can see here this also uses the navigation service. It uses a navigate method just like we did before, and we're passing it the type of detail page. And here we actually are passing a value as well.
Okay, great. So so passing the parameters looks very much the same as it does in the vanilla frame-based navigation that we get in the blank template.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
And if we look at the detail pages definition here, we can see that we have an on-navigated to, just like we had an on-navigated to in the basic template. And I have in here a parameter that I'm getting. Actually, I have a nifty new C#6 syntax here. Mm-hmm. You want to explain a little bit of what that does?
Sure. So one of the problems with code bloat that we sometimes have in previous versions of C# is we're always having to check to see whether an object is null before we call any of the methods or properties on such an object. This is a nice handy piece of syntactic sugar, which basically just means something that the compiler gives us that saves us writing a bunch of code that says parameter question mark. The question mark says if parameter is null, don't bother executing anything else beyond this string and just return null. Otherwise, do parameter null, or if the parameter is not null, I should say, then we're going to invoke the toString method on it.
Nice. Well, that certainly helps keep code concise. So, well, as we've seen, navigation is not that different using template 10. We use a navigation service rather than a frame.
Yep.
But we can still pass parameters. We can still navigate to pages. All that seems pretty consistent.
And the great thing is we're not having to worry about all of the events for the shell back button or anything like that. It's just handled for us.
Great.
Great.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Steve. So let's sum up what we covered in this module. We took a brief look through the application patterns. We then took a deeper dive into navigation and looked at how we can implement that ourselves using the out-of-the-box capabilities. Then we took a quick look into template 10, introduced it briefly, and then looked at how navigation is simplified within the template 10 library and how that could be a great basis for building your applications. We've also mentioned a number of the resources that are available on MSDN, and here's a couple of links to the UI patterns and to navigation in particular. Thanks very much for your time.